So I just wanted to hop on, sort of have a sort of raw, uncut video, just reacting to a few things here and there. Today's I just wanted to talk about TJ McConnell and Doug McDermott's upcoming contracts. I think that a lot of Pacers fans, myself included, are a little worried about losing those two players, being somewhat key to how we've built our team over the time. If you're in sort of the Sabonis camp, you really are a little worried on how that might work because him and McDermott worked so well over time. And probably even if you're a Miles Turner fan over a Sabonis fan. I know that split is kind of stark. But with TJ McConnell, I think there's a lot of worry that people have with just the leadership that he's brought and some of the stability that he's brought to the team. And I just want to point out a few of the problems that I have with that, I guess, hesitation to move on from those players. I think that a lot of times players always value their players more than some unknown commodity that they could have. It's sort of that like fear the unknown versus fear the known. And I think when it comes to Doug McDermott and TJ McConnell, you have two really good, solid players over the time that you've been playing with that may seem unreplaceable. They really aren't. And some of the players that we could replace with those could either be through the draft or at a somewhat reasonable level contract that you could sign either of TJ McConnell or Doug McDermott. And so I don't want to go through a list of names, but I think if the Pacers fans just remember what life before having Doug McDermott and TJ McConnell was like, there are other avenues, right, that you could build out this team without probably even ruining the chemistry. So let's just take TJ McConnell first. I think with TJ McConnell, what he gives you is a lot of leadership. Like I had said earlier, TJ McConnell also provides you with this, I wouldn't necessarily say exceptional quality defense. He's a good defender, but I think his defensive prowess comes more from like this sort of determination, scrappiness, and just all-around effort, which I think Indiana fans, if we're being honest, I think there is a level of like Indiana pride within TJ McConnell that we love hard workers. We love people that just scrap and fight. And that's always kind of been that mentality of the Pacers team, is that scrap that you have with, one of those sort of bottom market teams. And TJ McConnell sort of wears that as his mantra. And I think that outside of like actual quality that a player brings to your team, I think there is sort of that love for that type of player that is also our fascination with TJ McConnell. And I think when you look at what TJ McConnell is currently on, I think it's around like I could be wrong, but I think it's like a two-year, $7 million contract. He's going to be making more than that, right, in his next deal. And there comes a point where you have to figure out whether, just with any player, where is that capping point that you're going to say that's too much. And I think with TJ McConnell, I've been sort of wrestling around with trying to figure out, do you want to pay him that sort of maybe upper echelon $10 million contract per year, which I think is just outlandish. I can't imagine paying a backup point guard that much money when you are considering that he could even potentially in about 3 years' time not even be your backup point guard, but your third string point guard. And so when it comes to TJ McConnell, I sort of find myself around that like $7 or $8 million being that maybe the maximum that I would feel comfortable going. I think there's a level of comfort with me with saying if you're going to sign a 3-year, $15 million deal, around like a $5 million each year, I feel very comfortable with that, just for the fact that even if you're accepting that he's going to be a third string point guard, I feel like I might have said quarterback earlier, which in a sense he is, but like if you're going to pay that sort of third string point guard $5 million and reason that that's an acceptable price, I think there's a lot of things that go into that, right? So like if you are going to think about paying some sort of players coach, like a player personnel coach, like an Al Jefferson that you want to bring in to just manage over the players and sort of have that camaraderie and things like that, there is a level of value where if you're saying that you're going to pay one of those assistant coaches, let's say $500,000, I really have no idea what those coaches get paid, but let's even say it's $1 million. If you're going to pay one of those coaches $1 million, then you would think, okay, then let's just take that $1 million off of that fear that we had of giving to TJ McConnell, because he's fulfilling that role as that player's coach. And so I think bumping him up $1 million makes sense just for the fact that he is fulfilling other responsibilities outside of just being potentially a third string point guard. The problem with TJ McConnell is I think it's good to remember the hesitation that we've had with Ben Simmons and put that toward another player like a TJ McConnell, where they're not even they're not the same players. So don't take this sort of as like a comparison, but think about what we do with TJ McConnell and Ben Simmons. We point out problems in Ben Simmons' game, like the fact that he doesn't take 3-point shots, and the fact that he's not really a threat on that perimeter. So when he is out along the perimeter, guards and forwards can pull back from TJ McConnell because they don't fear that he's going to take the shot. And even if he does take the shot, they don't fear that it's going to go in. The man averaged around like half a 3-point shot a game. Now, that said, he does take a lot more 3-point shots than Ben Simmons took. Ben Simmons only takes 3-point shots when it's like a last-second shot. So, I understand that they are very different, but I don't see the Pacers treating TJ McConnell's lack of contribution on the 3-point perimeter as big as a problem as they might see having your first point guard within if you ever brought in like a Ben Simmons. They don't carry that over. And so I just think I think the Pacers need to consider that there could be a better option for TJ McConnell for just a little bit more or around the same amount. And I think there's two avenues that you have to look. So when you look through the draft, which is kind of our first option, or one of our options when you're looking at replacing TJ McConnell, you have to look at about like what those players make. And we can only go right now, for myself, we can really only go off of last year's numbers. And those numbers were, if you're drafting 13th overall, that player is probably going to make about $3 to $5 million over that span of basically, at least last year, they got around like a 4-year contract, which started at about $3 million some or so dollars and ended around $6 million or so on the 4th year. There's a 5th year, which is sort of a qualifying offer, which, if he's a good player, he's probably going to turn down. And so you can just see it as like a sort of guaranteed 4-year contract. And I think even 2 of those years are team options. So that's even a nice thing that you could, in theory, say that you could cut ties with them really quick. And so if you think about people that you could sign in the draft, I'm sure you could find someone that would be reliable, throwing out names like a Sharif Cooper. He's not going to bring everything that McConnell did bring, but he's going to bring other things that McConnell didn't bring. And I think that's something that we forget to look at. It's not just the things that they're not going to match, but the things that they bring that the other player, we didn't even think about the fact that they didn't have. And so you look at players like Sharif Cooper, Trey Mann. These are point guards that I think you could bring in that would have that, I think a good level of reliability. And those players you could probably trade down to actually get, and then add a veteran on top of that. And so I think when you're looking at TJ McConnell's contract, we have to take that emotional side out of this, and our sort of Indiana pride of effort and all of that type of love for scrap and all of that. We have to sort of take that out to just say, what's the best fit for this team contract-wise and for the next few years? So where I end up on TJ McConnell is just sort of at that level of like, if you're paying TJ McConnell around $8 million and under, right, and you sign him on like a 3-year deal, I think I can understand that. If you're getting anywhere over that $8 million mark, I find it hard to reconcile that for the value, even when you think about things like opportunity cost, right? So like the fact that you have McConnell means that you probably don't have another point guard running the show in the secondary unit. And if you ever do want to have that secondary point guard run, then you're paying $8 million for a leader, but a leader that's not really paying. You're paying $8 million for an insurance policy. And I just think $8 million for an insurance policy can be rationalized, but I don't know if it's the best bet. So sort of below that mark is where I would probably find myself on the TJ McConnell line. Above that, I think you just have to make a different decision. And you could look into the free agency market for players like Patty Mills that could provide a veteran leadership. He may cost a little bit more, but he also provides a little bit more, I think, at least as far as 3-point percentage goes, and the same level of that veteran leadership. So there's just this sort of like with anything, there's this sort of battle that you have to go through that you just have to have those stopping points of saying, the level of his play outweighs this sort of emotional tie that I have to this and that fear of the unknown. That said, of the two, I think I would probably lean more toward keeping TJ McConnell than I would toward Doug McDermott. Which brings us over into Doug McDermott. I think that the value that you have with Doug McDermott can be had or found in the draft or in some sort of mid-level exception. I think that same value that you're trying to get with Doug McDermott, you look at players that have signed contracts in this past, I think the past year you had a few contracts that were signed, the past few years. Joe Harris signed one, and I think it was Davis Bertans. I think their contracts were both around like $15 million. If I'm wrong, just correct me in the comments. But I think those were two around $15 million per year, which, that's a price for a shooter, I think, in today's NBA. The question is that the price that you would choose to pay for a shooter if you didn't have to? And we go back to that same comparison that I had in the draft with what you can sign a player. Again, I'm going back to 2020's salary stats, but it was around like $3 million that you're going to pay for a 13th overall pick, $3 to $4 million, and then that would stretch around toward like $7 million at the fourth year. And then when you trade down to about the 20th pick, you're looking at around $2 to $3 million and stretching down to about $6 million on the fourth year. So I think a lot of fans within the Pacers fan base hate the idea of Corey Kispert. And I think it's just this sort of obvious, Pacers bring in a bunch of white players, and there's just this fear of Indiana continuing doing that. And I think it's, I don't know, it's definitely a justified fear and hesitation. And I think there's just this fear of drafting TJ Leaf again. I think when you look at somebody like Corey Kispert, you have a lot of potential there of a player that could be really, really similar to a Doug McDermott. When you're picking around number 13, I think you have a few decisions to make, right? You're deciding whether to draft for a star or a potential star. You have the decision to sort of insert player into said option that your other player just left. So like Doug McDermott in this case. And that would be maybe Corey Kispert. Or you have the option to draft for long-term potential, I think, which would be maybe players more in line with a Kai Jones, if you actually thought that he could transition into a 3 or 4 role, which I think is a very long-term plan. I don't know if that would actually work out, but he could span a lot of positions. Or you're looking at a player like JT Thor, who is a freak in measurements and his athleticism and what he can do. He can shoot. So I think, there's kind of 3 models of drafting. And I do not think the Pacers are looking with that third one that I gave, which is like a JT Thor or a Kai Jones. I don't think that long-term potential is something that they're really considering, unless they're trading back to get that, and to basically they'll get rid of not Bruce Bowen. I can't remember his name. But to get rid of some of those players that we had that were on the last part of our bench, and just to refill those with players that we could get in the draft that we could kind of build up. I don't think that that's the model we're going after, but we could. But you could also look at players like Corey Kispert, who could just fulfill a role at a much cheaper contract for 4 years. And we've realized that contracts, cheap contracts aren't just valuable for the 4 years that you have the player, right? Contracts are really valuable for trading commodities. So if Corey Kispert pans out really well within that first year, you can attach that contract in terms of trying to get another player back if he produced really well, if you actually want to trade that contract. Also, you can't really have enough shooters. If the shooters can play some manageable level of defense, then, you can just put them on the floor whenever. And Kispert does have some level of defense. And he cuts like Doug McDermott does. And so I think there is an understandable reason for those people that want a Corey Kispert type player. That said, at the same time, I think that basketball fans sometimes forget that I think there's just this weird attachment to these types of 3-point threats and them being white. And I think Pacers fans, or just all fans in general, forget that that's not the case. And so there are so many players that we're not talking about that can fulfill that Doug McDermott role, that don't look like Doug McDermott, that don't also possess some of those bad tendencies that Doug McDermott or a Corey Kispert might have. And so you're talking about players like Jared Butler, that if Jared Butler passes all these medical things that he's going through, Jared Butler is a stud. And Jared Butler will at least be a good 6th man. He's a great defender. He's a good spot-up shooter. He can drive. I think somebody like Jared Butler, especially if you're trading back, somebody like Jared Butler is I think someone that is going to be, it's going to be regretted that he wasn't drafted earlier. He's got a good head on his shoulders too. Seems like a natural leader. I think a Jared Butler signing would be great. But then you have people like Bones Highland, who is a wonderful shooter. And, you can sort of take this back into a few other players. Like I think Trey Murray III is a good shooter. Most of these players all have really good free throw percentage as well. So you would think that it would translate over. It's not just like a shooter with a good shooting streak for a while. You have Moses Moody is a good 3-point shooter. All this to say, there are so many other shooters that you have the option of grabbing that aren't Corey Kispert. But I still do think that decision of replacing Doug McDermott with someone is a smart decision to make. If you're gonna think about paying Doug McDermott $15 million, let's just take what some of those other players were paid. $50 million for Doug McDermott. I can't do that. And I don't think the Pacers should do that. Because, at that point, you're sort of handicapping yourself of what else you can sign, especially for a sixth man. You're getting really close to what you're paying players like, Miles Turner for. And I think that would be a mistake to sign him for that large of a contract. Even if you're talking about $12 million, I think that makes more sense. I find that to be still something I'm not sure I would do. And I don't know if you're getting much lower than that. And so I think unless you can sign a long-term deal with Doug McDermott for a very cheap price, it might be worth looking elsewhere. You have to obviously think about relationships and how that's going to affect things on the squad. But for just numbers alone, I think that you would be better off probably letting that contract go. Now, you have to have a plan in place of who you're going to sign instead. And again, the same thing goes with TJ McConnell. We look at all the valuable things that Doug McDermott offers us, but we don't think about the things that he really doesn't offer us. He's an okay defender, but if you could find a player that offers the same shooting skill, but also provides some level of defense, like shutdown defense, then you'd be better off signing a player like that. Carlisle does play rookies somewhat well, and I think there could be a level of safety in giving him a few rookies, especially if you're trading down. Then you could find two rookies, 3-point threats, right? And then sign a veteran on top of that. Again, I think there's a case for signing Doug McDermott. He offers a lot more than just threes. He offers his cutting ability is extremely valuable when it comes to keeping a player like Sabonis. And I don't think that can be looked over. But yeah, I think it's a difficult conversation to sign a player like that to such a large contract. So this leaves us with, players to sign. And that will probably be in another episode when I look at a few free agents. As of right now, I think that if you are going to trade back in the draft, if you've decided that you're going to trade back in the draft, you're probably doing that because you're either going to get an up-and-coming player alongside those picks, unless you're getting just multiple picks, or you're getting a veteran on top of that. Either that veteran or the underrated player might be able to fulfill that Doug McDermott role alone. And then you have these other players that you draft that it would be smart for the Pacers to start throwing players in and playing rookies because we tend to not do that. And I think all this said, if you're deciding between these few options, I think it's a difficult decision to make, but I think you should probably end up cutting ties with TJ McConnell and Doug McDermott and finding ways to replace them, unless you can find those wonderful deals that may not be there. So again, that is just sort of my thoughts on Doug McDermott and TJ McConnell. What we'll probably talk about in the next one is, like I said, just some of the free agents we could sign. And then I might do another episode on some of the draft prospects that I think would be worthwhile. So that's all I have today. Thanks for watching. Get out of my house.